This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome back, everyone, to our later afternoon session. My name is Caroline Levine. I'm a professor in the English department here of relatively recent date, so I unfortunately can't claim to have been a student or trained by Dan, but I have the great pleasure of introducing Janice Carlisle, who was a PhD student of his. She got her PhD here from Cornell. And after she left, she taught at the University of Virginia, Washington University, and Tulane before joining the English department at Yale in 2004. And I know it must be a little bit of a disappointment to end up at Yale after being at Cornell, but you know, it's okay, I guess. She's published books and articles on Victorian fiction, autobiography, and visual culture, including most recently a book called Picturing Reform in Victorian Britain, which examines painting, politics, and illustrated journalism from the 1830s to the 1860s. She served as a president of the Narrative Society, which Dan Schwarz co-founded. And right now she's writing a book about the Victorian painter Ford Madox Brown. Her talk today is titled Reconfiguring Word and Image. Please join me in welcoming Janice Carlisle.
Actually, it's very much a step up to be at Cornell rather than at Yale. I was just saying how wonderfully in advance the technology is here. I do appreciate that. And I do also appreciate the quality of the faculty, including Caroline, whose work I admire very much. I have quite a few thank yous to offer today. I don't want this fact to make you think that my paper is correspondingly long. It isn't, and I won't be talking until dinner time, I promise you. First of all, I would like to thank, of course, the conference organizers. I'm honored to be here, honored to have been invited, and it's been an extraordinary pleasure to be on the Cornell campus again, to walk between Olin and Goldwyn Smith. And I think in the 4 years I was here as a graduate student, that was the only walking I ever did. Never went any other place. I would also like to thank particularly the panelists this morning for the wonderful ways in which they've helped us understand the full extent of Dan's influence as a teacher and a scholar. And then I have a couple of more personal thanks. I'm grateful that the fourth nor'easter that we have had in Connecticut, so much for the non-existence of climate change, I am glad that that fourth nor'easter let up early enough to allow me to spend one thrilling morning working in the archives in the Rare Book Room, which is named after my fellow graduate student and my dear friend, Elizabeth Reed. So I would like to thank Elizabeth for her friendship and Dr. George Reed for the generosity that made that reading room possible. And finally, of course, I would like to thank Dan. I arrived at Cornell as a first-year graduate student only a year after Dan became an assistant professor here. And though I don't think he had yet articulated his mantra, I had already learned the always the text part of it, but always historicize was added to my understanding of approaches to literature, and I have treasured that ever since. As Dan said yesterday, I was his TA in the first large lecture course that he taught. He also said that he wasn't sure if he had done a good job. He was, of course, a wonderful lecturer. Even his first time out, he was full of enthusiasm and energy and confidence. As a matter of fact, it was rather difficult to be his TA because I would be scribbling as fast as I could to get down every idea to make sure that I knew what he had said. And then I would look up at the podium to try to find him, and he was almost never there. He was here, he was there, he was with the students, he was behind another piece of furniture, he was closer to the students. And that was to me just extraordinary. I had come from what was still a relatively prim women's college in the 1960s, and I thought a lecturer's feet had to be nailed to the floor. So Dan, thank you very much for one of my first lessons in teaching. Subsequently, over a period of years and decades, I've had many reasons to be grateful to Dan, and I have been grateful as his student and later on as his collaborator, and I'm very happy to have this public occasion to say, once again, thank you, Dan. Today I would like to start by also paying tribute to Dan's work on the age-old intractable problem of word and image. I take my title from his book, Reconfiguring Modernism, his study of the relationships between text and image in modernist literature and 20th century art. In Reconfiguring Modernism, Dan looks for, quote, sources, parallels, correspondences, continuities, affinities between those two media so that he can, quote, use art to read literature and literature to read art, unquote. I label the relation between word and image an intractable problem because attempts to solve it have created a millennia-long tradition of commentary and debate. Always first cited is the philosopher Simonides, who in either the 6th or the 5th century BCE called painting mute poetry and poetry a speaking picture. Most cogent of recent experts on this problem is W.J.T. Mitchell, who in picture theory notes, quote, all arts are composite arts, both text and image. All media are mixed media, unquote. As you can tell from the title slide of my PowerPoint, today I will be dealing with a painting that Mitchell would call an image text. And that's one word because it suggests that both media are in the same art object. But the theorist most pertinent to my argument today is Lessing, who in his Laocoon famously distinguished between poetry as an art in time and painting as an art in space. Often challenged, but more often cited uncritically, this dictum undergirds my central question, and I have lots of questions today. What kind of light is shed on the problem of word and image, I want to ask, when the words are actually painted into the image? What the viewer of this painting, which I will shortly share with you, can glean from this carefully rendered, though partially obscured passage of print, is an item of up-to-date news. A robbery of great violence has taken place, and a reward of £50 and a Queen's pardon is being offered for information about the perpetrators of this outrage. My example comes, as the Victorianists in the audience have no doubt already guessed, from Ford Madox Brown's work, his epic painting. Brown, who is probably best known among modernists as Ford Madox Ford's beloved grandfather, was a painter on the fringes of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and in other ways, by birth and training and temperament, an inveterate outsider. Born in Calais, he moved to London only in his 20s after having studied art in Belgium and Paris. Brown labored on and off over this canvas, epic in size alone, by 4.5 feet by almost 6.5 feet, for 13 years between 1852 and 1865, and it reflects the labor that he lavished on it despite periods of intense poverty and discouragement. The painting is so detailed that reproductions cannot do any justice to the legibility of its every inch. It shares a Pre-Raphaelite impulse to depict everything in the background as clearly as everything in the foreground. And I'll be switching back and forth between two images of work today. This one gives you a pretty good idea of the colors of the painting. Frequently treated as an icon of mid-Victorian culture, Brown's masterpiece has rightly earned that status by virtue of its vivid presentation of a social panorama and its celebration of the highly prized Victorian value named in its title. By depicting a scene on an actual street in Hampstead, Brown was making visible an everyday nuisance that irritated many Victorian Londoners, the street obstructions caused by all kinds of material improvements. Brown witnessed such an obstruction when he saw at the bottom of Heath Street a group of excavators, or navvies, as they were called, digging ditches for a new water system. And his painting turns these working class men into icons of the dignity of manual labor. As you can see, I hope, the wall placard circulating the news about a robbery appears on the very far left-hand side of work, partly covered by the herb gatherer's basket in front of it. Do you see where it is? Okay. Along with the question of how such painted print might configure the relation of word and image, I want to ask also if Ford Madox Brown's inclusion of a number of texts in work provides a perspective on the painting itself. Work is a very puzzling painting, in part because of the ways in which it represents the complexities of Victorian society. Homeric in its ambitions to be as comprehensive as possible, it offers an image of the material realities of an apparently complete mid-Victorian social world. Brown's scene brings together rich and poor, English and Irish, young and old, sweating men and mincing women, the intellectual from the city, and the agricultural laborer from the country. All these people engage in their characteristic everyday activities: taking exercise, selling flowers or oranges, talking, drinking, resting or sleeping, delivering baked goods and the mail, promoting a political candidate, policing the streets, tending the young, and most prominently, digging a trench. As I have said, central to this painting is the obstruction of street traffic caused by the work of the navvies. The figures on the viewer's left are forced to go single file past these workers. Behind them, the impoverished herb gatherer are a well-dressed lady and her older counterpart, who is distributing evangelical tracts to the navvies to her left. Behind and above the working class men are two genteel horseback riders, a gentleman and young lady, who are having even more difficulty passing down the street than those on foot. To the right are a navvy drinking beer, a beer cellar. In the declivity beyond the fence, agricultural laborers on the tramp, and in the deep background, a group of sandwich board carriers advertising the candidacy of Bobus for a seat in Parliament. On the right margin is a recognizable portrait of Thomas Carlyle, the famously irascible advocate for the sacredness of work, and the creator in past and present of the character Bobus, a vulgar manufacturer made rich by turning out sausages. Next to Carlyle, on the margin, is Frederick Maurice, the Anglican priest who was the principal founder of the Working Men's College. At first, work seems to be another of the Victorian depictions of crowds so immensely popular with their first viewers, a scene like that in William Powell Frith's The Railway Station of 1862. Frith's painting epitomizes the Victorian love of narrative art. A picture was often considered good to the extent that it gratified its viewers' desires to tell stories about its subjects. As one contemporary reviewer said of the railroad station, quote, "The picture tells its own tale. It is one of the most stirring novels of the day, full of life and character," end quote, as if Frith were a Dickens in paint. You see, it's hard to keep those two media separate. Yet if one juxtaposes the railway station and work in good art historical fashion, it becomes clear that something strange is happening or not happening in the social scene that Brown depicts. Frith's figures cluster in small groups of 3 or 4, interacting with one another in ways that prompted its Victorian viewers to speculate about where these figures have been, why they are in the station, and where they are going. Frith spreads his vignettes across the canvas, inviting the viewer to pause over one and then another. I want to show you 2 details from the railway station that my students particularly love. The one on the left shows a family saying goodbye to their 2 young sons who are going off to school. The smallest or the younger of those 2 boys hasn't been there, so he doesn't know what he's going to get into. The older one knows exactly what's going to happen, and if you could see the painting close up, you would know that he has a tear coming down his cheek as he says goodbye to his parents. The other one is a sallow young man who's being arrested by 2 detectives as his anxious wife looks on. Brown's work, by contrast, seems largely to be a depiction of people who are not interacting with each other. Few encounters are or could take place within its confines. There is only one genuinely Frith-like vignette in work, that involving the badly clad girl in the foreground who's trying to keep her orphan siblings in order. Tellingly, no one else in the scene is at all interested in their plight, least of all Thomas Carlyle or the benevolent clergyman who might be expected to offer them, respectively, words or charity. Carlyle would never offer anything but words, trust me. Other instances of posture and orientation create similar effects. The people depicted in work simply don't look at each other face to face. Carlyle, as he talks to Maurice, turns to him only obliquely, and the parents cradling their child do not exchange glances. Moreover, the central navvy seems completely unaware of even the men with whom he is working. The open mouth of the beer seller makes it clear that he is hawking his wares, but his raised head would keep him from seeing if anyone might be interested in a tankard of ale. The navvy above him has already gotten his beer, but the position required for him to be drinking it cuts him off from those around him. Even the young girl in red does not look directly at the brother she is chastising or at her 2 other siblings. The postural relations of these figures to each other epitomize what the historian James Vernon takes to be the central characteristic of modernity for which 19th century Britain was responsible. By mid-century, it had created what Vernon calls a society of strangers. Strangers who, in an only apparently paradoxical fashion, became less and less known to each other as they were more and more crowded together. What Brown recognized in his culture, what he depicted in work, is a society of strangers. In these 2 paintings, therefore, vignette and composition seem to be in inverse relation to each other. And by composition, I mean what John Ruskin meant in The Elements of Drawing, quote, putting several things together so to make one thing out of them. And in this definition, the emphasis falls on the one thing. That's what Ruskin would like to see. In the railway station, the dominance of narrative renders composition secondary. Frith arranges his figures along an imaginary line that seems to be there only to make possible the full display of the stories that proliferate along it. Conversely, the relative lack of narrative in work makes composition more significant, more productive of meaning than it is in the railway station, and narrative less so. And I should say, these generalizations require some qualification, the major one being that when Ford Madox Brown wrote an exhibition catalog for his 1865 exhibition, solo exhibition of his paintings, he created extraordinarily elaborate stories about all of the figures in this painting. And I think he did that because he had spent so many years with them. He had to imagine that they had existed elsewhere and would exist after he finished this canvas which was very difficult for him to finish. But in this instance, I go back to my graduate school training. It was no doubt Dan, who often quoted the proverbial wisdom from Lawrence's Studies in Classic American Literature, quote, "Never trust the teller, trust the tale." In this instance, I choose to trust the painted image, not its painter. The central compositional feature of work is the triangular assemblage of the main figures in the painting, a grouping that visually depicts Victorian notions of hierarchy. If one works from top to bottom, from middle distance to foreground, there are first the representatives of the gentry, riding in the shade. Below them are the navvies, below them the orphan siblings, and beneath them, even lower on the social scale, are an array of canine figures, top to bottom, high to low. Along the left side of this triangular mass is another version of this ranking. At the top, the well-heeled evangelical lady, a beautifully dressed young woman, and the herb gatherer, again, high to low. The depiction of hierarchy is not perfectly consistent. The figures on the right are not as neatly arrayed according to their social status as the ones on the left. But depending upon where one sets the right leg of the triangle, the arrangement is drinking, navvy, beer cellar, and boy, again, high to low. But what is one to make of this visualization of social stratification? Do the sunshine on the figures of the navvies and the relative size of their group overturn hierarchy by making working class men the firm base of Victorian society? Does the shadow that covers the genteel horseback riders render them relatively insignificant? Or does that shadow suggest instead that they stand for the often only partially seen, but nonetheless most powerful segments of society that rule it because they are at its apex? And these questions raise a more fully specified version of the one with which I began. Will thinking about the painted print of work help us understand what it might be saying about the structure of the society that it depicts? Brown's inclusion in work of many instances of text seems to indicate that they may offer a perspective on his street scene. On one wall, along with a placard about a robbery, are many other bits of writing, announcements of a charitable event for the boys' home, a gigantic sale, and perhaps the classes at the Working Men's College. Just to offer a few more examples, certainly not all that could be cited, there are, in the background, the sandwich boards entreating passers-by to vote for Bogus. And this is my very favorite. I hope you can see that this is a mud-besmirched sign that has on it the words OBUS for bogus. And then on it, someone has very emphatically written the word don't, which would be probably Guai's, in a number of different circumstances. As if that were not enough, the frame of work has engraved into it 4 biblical sayings. The one above the arch that determines the quasi-religious shape of the painting is Carlisle's favorite ode to productivity. Quote, "I must work while it is day, for night cometh when no man can work." Why all these words? Some answers relate to the status of work as an image text. Often writing in this painting serves as a commentary on its subjects or as opportunities for Brown to exercise his well-known sense of humor. The name of Bobus, the absent candidate, is made more ridiculous by its repetition on the sandwich boards. The posting of the interim vote tally reveals that Bobus is unaccountably winning this parliamentary election, and that outcome reflects both Carlisle's and Brown's contempt for institutional politics. And you can see that Brown's favorite novelist, Thackeray, who he said was the word artist of them all, is really humiliatingly losing this election. I can't tell you why. But to return to my question, how do the texts of work help one make sense of its depiction of hierarchy? The sheer number of painted words in work, I think, reconfigure the problem of word and image by emphasizing the different ways in which texts and pictures are perceived. The biblical saying on the left side of the arch of the frame, like almost all the texts in work, stresses the fact that readers in Western cultures move their eyes from left to right and then from top to bottom by asking its viewers to follow exactly that pattern. By demonstrating that writing is perceived through simple, well-defined, and repetitive motions, work comments on Lessing's identification of poetry as an art in space. See, I did it again. I just want to break down that distinction. Let me try again here. Lessing's identification of poetry as an art in time and painting as an art in space. Both text and image are arts in space. If images, particularly Victorian images, evoke and are surrounded by words, if they exist in time as well as space, then text, according to Brown's work, is a spatial art. The point is not merely that words have to have a material embodiment to be read, that text is itself a visual depiction of words, but that the reader's eyes must move through space in a particular and highly specified way if a text is to be read at all. The idea that pictures are to be read like text has often been adopted by art historians, despite the occasional outcry against linguistic imperialism. But they are much less accommodating when it comes to accepting the notion that texts and pictures are perceived in analogous fashions. The very thought that one looks at a painting from the top left to bottom right as if it were writing made an otherwise even-tempered art historian friend of mine swear like a sailor. And she did. I'm not making this up. So I'm not suggesting here that the words in work ask the viewer to read only from left to right and top to bottom. What I am saying is that the painting itself raises that possibility. Moreover, by asking the viewer to read many of its texts, literally its passages, in a conventional fashion, work also raises the question of how paintings, on the contrary, are visually processed. If poetry is an art in space that demands certain movements of the eye, is there any typical way in which eyes move around a canvas? Now, here's the point at which you're going to think that I will be speaking until dinner time, but have no fear. Not surprisingly, the findings of neuroscience and psychophysiology offer some answers to this question. Remarkably, however, for my purposes at least, the scientific visualizations of how viewers perceive pictures and read texts that are still being reproduced in the most up-to-date accounts of vision result from experiments that began to be conducted in the late 19th century. Although it is notoriously difficult to track eye movements, even when the subject's head is held stationary and the object looked at is motionless, a great deal of research starting in the Victorian period has been done about how eyes move across print during the act of reading. The 20th century's most renowned figure in the field that's now called oculomotor behavior was the Soviet scientist A.L. Yarbus, who in the 1950s and 60s developed a risky but very effective way to record eye movements. He attached a rubber cap to the subject's anesthetized eyeball and captured the movements of the eye by recording the light reflected in a small mirror attached to the cap. Doubts about Yarbus's results and his interpretations of them were raised at the end of the 20th century, but the most recent research has led to their reacceptance, and his experiments are now recognized as not only classic, but also elegant. Here are two of Yarbus's recordings of how the eye moves across and down the text of a Shakespeare sonnet. That is in Russian, not in English. And I think the recording on the left is easier to actually see as a way of visualizing eye movements. These two records visualize the basic understanding of the motion involved in all vision. Eyes move in a series of discontinuous jerks and pauses, each one occurring in a fraction of a second. But in reading, as Yarbus demonstrated, that motion left to right is followed by a sweep of the eyes back to the beginning of the next line. So there's no pause in that sweep. There's no fixation because there's nothing to fix the eye on. To record how the eye moves in the perception of a picture, Yarbus asked his subjects to look at this 19th century Russian painting and to undertake a series of different tasks. The results of his many experiments using this picture prove that one's eyes move over images in ways that are to an extent determined by the features of that image. But much more important is the higher level factor of what one wants to understand about it. The first record here depicts a free, that is, unguided viewing of the painting. Yarbus said, "Look at this painting." The second, the results of the same viewers having been asked a difficult interpretive question. How long has the unexpected visitor been away from the family? A question that initiates a very different pattern of movements and fixations. Yarbus's use of the word free to describe unguided viewing is, I think, apposite. Here's an earlier record of movements during reading, and again the results of the free reading of "They did not expect to see him." Text instructs its readers to move their eyes in a rigidly prescribed fashion. Paintings offer themselves as exercises in a kind of perceptual liberty or freedom. Features of a painting, of course, offer guides to what the viewer might choose to look at, but those instructions are heeded or ignored depending on what he or she feels or wants to know when looking at it. Variations in the scan paths of different viewers are, as Yarbus proved, almost endless. Work itself makes this point about the free movement of the eye across its canvas. Simply because it's so crowded with easily perceived and therefore compelling details, it encourages its viewers to roam across its space in an almost profligate fashion, moving from one part of the scene to another, focusing on one figure or another as their different interests determine. The effect of this perceptual motion, like the pre-Raphaelite sharpness of detail, is a kind of visual democracy. Conventional registers of value, size, large or small, economic status, rich or poor, do not seem to obtain as ways of instructing the viewer on how to see the painting. Moreover, the identification of both text and picture as arts in space provides a way of thinking about the hierarchies depicted in work. The large numbers of texts in and around this painting might actually suggest that the viewer look at it in ways appropriate to both word and image. As Dan says in Reconfiguring Modernism, when he analyzes from left to right one of the shared features of the three figures in Picasso's The Dance, that is, quote, not the only way to read a picture, but it is the mode to which we are most accustomed, unquote. Along with the visualizations of hierarchy and work that move like text from top to bottom, there are two other, less messy and therefore less qualified depictions that become apparent as soon as one reads the painting as if it were printed text by moving one's eye from left to right. In the foreground of the painting are the figures of the herb gatherer, the navvies, the beer man, Carlisle, and Maurice, low to high. At the very front of the image, however, are its dogs. The red-coated greyhound, the navvy's bull pup, and the tattered mutt associated with the poor children, high to low. In a text, the last item in a series is traditionally the most important. In the entry on Bathos in his Glossary of Literary Terms, the Harvard-educated M.H. Abrams, here I should stop and tell you that I would like to say Mike Abrams, but I was very young when he was my professor, and I can't form the word Mike when it is connected to the word Abrams. The Harvard-educated M.H. Abrams, probably with some delight, cited as an example of such thinking the slogan, "For God, for country, and for Yale," noting that it is, quote, pathetic because it moves to intentional climax and rhetorical order and to unintentional descent in significance, at least for someone who is not a Yale man, unquote. According to this rhetorical principle, of the visual series, the multiple hierarchies in work, 3 or perhaps 4 of the series end with a so-called low figure, and only 1 ends with the high. In this particular context, then, the low win out over the high because the visual emphasis falls on the former rather than on the latter. The relatively free ways of perceiving a picture that Yarbus discovered, ways that depend in part on what one wants from such an art object, can yield different, though confirmatory, results. If I move my eyes around Brown's painting, looking for its workers, my list includes, of course, the navvies, the beer cellar, the farm laborers. Yet Ruskin describes a qualified form of visual freedom when he sets out one of his laws of composition in The Elements of Drawing. He contends that only long looking will reveal the principal figure in a painting. Such a figure may be smaller than the others, tucked away in a corner. The chief figure might not, quote, catch the eye at first, but is gradually felt to be more and more conspicuous as we gaze, until we find that from that figure we can turn our eyes no more, unquote. Brown, in his 1865 exhibition catalog, labeled the central navvy, the one who mysteriously holds a rose between his teeth, don't ask me about that either, as the hero of the piece, but my long looking at work moves me to nominate for that honor the young girl in its foreground. In a number of ways, she anchors the scene, and my eye often travels to her figure along the diagonal created by the main navvy's body and the back of the worker in front of him. And she deserves more attention than her objection might seem to warrant. She is, after all, working, while many others in this painting are idling or resting or playing or sleeping. And she is doing the often unremunerated female labor of child minding. There are a number of important categories of laborers not present in work. As Tim Berenger has pointed out, there are no factory workers. Perhaps more important, there are no clerks. That army of black-coated, lower middle-class office staff that was emerging in the mid-19th century. But most important of all these omissions, I think, involves the absence of female servants, the largest class of female workers when Brown was painting work, as a matter of fact, through the entire 19th century. On one hand, the orphan girl wears a revealing item of clothing. It is presumably her mother's cast-off gown, a gown that might be predicting that she faces an inevitable future on the streets. On the other, she stands in for all those servant women who rose early, went to bed late, and between the beginnings and ends of their days had to clean and cook and wash and mend. Brown made this point explicitly in his 1865 catalog, and here I'm choosing to trust the teller, when he wrote that she has in her, quote, a germ or rudiment of good housewifery, unquote. Interpreting the painting with the kind of perceptual motion appropriate to his text reveals it to be an unconventional commentary on the structure of a society of strangers. Yet slowing down less rigidly prescribed ways of viewing a picture might also encourage one to see, as among the most engaged and responsible of its figures, an impoverished, hard-pressed, but hard-working girl, a figure representing all the female servants who are not in the painting, the women who, along with navvies and factory operatives, tended to the material needs and made possible on a daily basis the enjoyment of the physical improvements that characterized Victorian culture. Thank you. Certainly, of course.
I have a few minutes for questions.
And that's a really interesting perception, because what Brown wanted to do in this painting of modern life was to make it very much like a history painting. And many of the history paintings that won competitions to be placed in the new Houses of Parliament use something in the background, a plinth, a stand, a wall, to push the figures forward, and that gives them a design, a composition that makes one thing of them. But he does it here, and it just blows everything apart. No, I actually didn't, which is interesting. The way in which those flowers are placed up against the text, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, well, one version had the text and one version had the floral elements, and I assume the one with the text is the what should I say, the standard one?
Yes.
And where did the floral elements come from? Do you know anything about that?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the floral elements.
In those two triangles at the top,
Oh,
there was one version that did not have the text.
okay. You know why? I cheated.
Oh.
There are two versions of this painting. One is the large version in Manchester. One is a smaller version in Birmingham. And there are times when the smaller one is easier to see because the lighting on it is better. The lighting on it is better. So there may be two versions here. You know, that's a very good question. And when Jarbas did his experiments, many, what he discovered was really pretty interesting. There wasn't much difference between young viewers and old viewers, female viewers, male viewers, educated viewers, uneducated viewers. The difference was between art students and the general public. And the art students looked for shorter periods of time. Dan.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. I think that a lot of looking at paintings at this period still depended on Vasari's idea of receding perspective. People were actually taught to look not from left to right, but to look in depth.
Right.
And it really wasn't until Cezanne that people blocked, when the receding perspective was blocked, that people began to sort of read paintings. In other words, you were trained in traditional Renaissance painting, which was often religious painting, and maybe portraits, to look right in the middle and look backwards. And I think you made that point very well. I think in Reconfiguring Modernism, for example, the Les Damoiselles, which is we read it not from left to right, although there was a contention to do that because some of us knew the early version had blocked out something on the left-hand side. That is, originally, Les Damoiselles actually had two male figures in it, and sometimes that's on display in MoMA. They sometimes bring this out. But I still think that we learn in modern painting, we tend to go around in a circle a lot because the eye is blocked. And that also started people reading it textually from left to right. And my other comment, which is, I think I may have said in Reconfiguring Modernism, I'm thinking of Elderfield's preface to the Matisse catalog of 1992 and 1993, is when literary criticism sneezes, art criticism catches cold.
Right.
Which is to say that there was a lot of deconstructive jargon in art history catalogs for a while that it seemed to be like translating into gibberish. And Elderfield, I think, later was embarrassed by some of that. But I think what I liked about your paper so much is the clarity and and I learned from it because I talk about Frith a little bit, I think, in Reconfiguring Modernism, but I talk about it actually in class. And this was I thought that was great. And I think the storytelling of late Victorian painting is worth pointing out because Victorian painting, you've probably seen that catalog of Victorian painting, which has brought it really back into vogue in the early 80s. I can't think of the people who edited it, but it was really, Victorian painting wanted to be true to nature. I mean, there was a theory of art that underlay this, that the reason these paintings are inclusive are because that was the aesthetic ideology. Yeah. And of course, it related, as you know, to realistic fiction. And that's really all I want to say. But I think, thank you for such a wonderful paper.
Well, thank you. I think one of the things that's remarkable about this painting is that it crams all of its subjects into a small space that would be actually impossible in real life. And one of the things that Brown does is that he doesn't have any aerial perspective. So if you approach the painting and you look at that railing in the very back, you can see that there's a little girl who is turning over the railing. You can see that her skirt has fallen down and she has a bare bottom. I think he had an impulse to just bring together a great deal of material so that we would have to try to figure out how it relates to each other. Well, Brown himself wrote a sonnet about this painting, so he was interested in ekphrastic poetry. Well, in part, the color does help make connections between the figures, so that the beautiful young lady in the red gown is connected to the greyhound who seems to have gotten away from her. And I think the red makes very interesting comments connecting the beautiful young lady with the girl in the front of the painting. And I like to believe that the red in the various signs, the one that says, "Obus don't," and the red in the sandwich boards, sorry about this, sandwich the painting between them and raise the question of the status of institutional politics. We know Brown didn't like them, but in this painting, what was he doing with them?
I have a question, if I may use my status standing up here on the stage. Lee's talk made me think about the question of the human. And I just wondered if it's possible to make an argument that the center of this painting is not humans, but water. Because, you know, if we think about the herbs, and then beer, which is, you know, in some ways safer than water in this moment because...
In many ways.
Because of cholera and so forth and typhus. That right at the center of the painting is actually the work of making a sewer system. And could that be seen as the center of the painting as opposed to any of the humans in it?
The labor might be the center of the painting. I understand what you're saying. And the laborers are trying to create a system that will allow fresh water to come through the street to the people who will use it. And I can see that argument, but I think I go back to Dan's humanism. I like to think about the figures and the kinds of human life that stand behind them and that they represent. Sorry.
That's a long fight we'll have to have.
Okay, let's have it.
But are there other questions? Well, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.